Okay, so the questions that we've been invited to ponder are pretty big, enormous. So I thought I would just contribute some general thoughts about the history of the possibility of asking questions like, what is the meaning and role of theory for art history today? That question implies some interest in the state of the discipline named art history, its nature, its continuation, and so on. And it also tacitly entails an acceptance of the word theory, but that has its own history. So my comments are going to have to do with the history of periods, of decades, when the discipline of art history has identified itself by reference to theories, and when it hasn't. I think that might be helpful for historicizing a question like, what is the meaning and role of theory for art history today? And I'm going to conclude on a very different topic. I'm interested in the composition of the panel, like this one, on theory, with, let's say, not so young white North American scholars talking about theory in 2020. So I'll end with some comments on that. So I'll start with a little story about the Modern Language Association, the MLA. They have an annual conference that's much larger than the CAA. And for a number of years, they have had a theory forum, which they capitalize. A couple years ago, the theory forum was chaired by Carolyn Levine. I think it was 2018. And one of the panelists was Jane Gallup. In her presentation, she was talking about how to historicize the idea of talking about theory in the MLA in 2018. She said that there were two belatednesses involved. First, the MLA, quote, belatedly initiated the theory forum when it realized that theory was pedagogically distinct from criticism. And second, there was, quote, the weird belatedness of our current theory forum, that is the 2018 one, which she said was in, quote, some memorial relation to the moment when the theory forum was founded. So I don't want to accumulate belatednesses, and there are many differences between the way that the literary criticism, literary theory, literary history have negotiated their relation with theory and the way that art history has negotiated. But I think there are some interesting overlaps and parallels, and especially this question of, quote, weird double belatedness comes up in a different form in art history, so I'll come back to it. So I think it's possible, just for heuristic purposes, to sketch a history of art history in the last 120 years and divide it into decades when theories were taught and when they were used, when they were understood as essential to the discipline's sense of itself, to its definition of itself. So if you start at the beginning of the century, there were a number of interpretive methods. They were not called theories at that point. Some of them had deep genealogies, like connoisseurship. It was developed in the 18th century. When it was the name initially of an avocation or a set of interests. Style analysis is, of course, especially associated with Wölfflin, and so it had an institutional presence before the First World War. Formal analysis, especially in association with modernism, came into pedagogic practice a little bit later after World War I, especially in and around the Bauhaus. So I have a very rough kind of an ad hoc period there, 1910 to 1940, spanning the period before, during, and after the First World War, during which art history would have been associated with those interpretive methods and others. Then after that, from roughly the 1940s through the 1960s, iconography was central to the discipline's sense of itself. It's statistically demonstrable, I think, that iconography is still the default interpretive method worldwide. If you take a survey of journals categorized as art history in a large enough university library and look at the methodologies that are evident in the essays in the last 10 or 15 years, you would find that the majority of them are iconography, one sort or another. Still, at this point in mid-century, iconography was not spoken of as a theory. People did call it a method. Panofsky has called it a system. So we're not yet at the point where the wording of the question that has been posed to us would correspond with the self-description of the discipline. That happens a little bit later. So sometime in the 70s up until, say, 1990, with the sudden influx of French theory, this is where the question of our panel becomes visible, because these approaches and others were called theories. Of course, this is a schematic chronology, and social art history was well underway before that. Psychoanalysis, of course, was in the first decades of the 20th century. But nevertheless, the self-description, the self-understanding of the discipline as a collection of a particular set of theories, so-called, dates to these decades. And along with that, at the same time, came anxiety, famously exemplified in an art journal essay in the 70s, the anxiety of art history, because these are all imported from other disciplines. It's an entirely separate question about whether or not that anxiety should be thought of as something well-founded, because all of these and others were adapted and recontextualized by art historians. But at any rate, the appearance of a numerable set of nameable theories that were mostly distinctly French came along with an anxiety about the discipline, and therefore the first forms of a question like the question that's been put to us. There are two later stages to this, to fill out this timeline. First, there was this exponential growth from the 1990s up to the present of named theories, new theories, and that's just a list I put together. It could be doubled, it could be tripled. These are theories that it's the kind of thing that worries grad students. Oh my God, I don't know thing theory. I'd better read up on my Bill Brown, that kind of thing. And so this, in this state, makes it pretty much impossible to define the discipline in terms of its theories, not because they're imported or they create any kind of anxiety. It's pretty much the opposite, but because it's not a numerable set. So the question then actually does, for our panel, begins to get special traction. There is one most recent stage to this that I put at the end. I would put up at the end. There are a number of contemporary art historians who wouldn't necessarily want to enumerate, even for pedagogic purposes, when asked by a grad student, what are the theories that you use? They wouldn't want to do that. Instead, they would point to individual writers and texts and concepts. And that points to a lack of interest in the intellectual genealogies of these and a move away from the idea of numerable theories. So I am going to come back to that as I go along. But I want to complicate it in three ways. This will be my main contribution, I guess, here. Three complications of that schematic history. First of all, there are introductory texts in art history, and I'm thinking of the big survey texts, also a text like Art Since 1900, and others that are more conservative, that effectively pare the list down, the big list at the top of my timeline, so that it looks more like the list that was in the 70s. Art Since 1900 is the clearest example of that, because it begins with 4 methodological introductions written by the 4 principal authors, and each one of those has remarkable absences, like phenomenology is not one of the named methods, interpretive methods, even though Yves Lenbois is one of the 4 authors. Feminism is also absent, and so on. And other textbooks implicitly, without the use of these methodological introductions, tend to delimit the list of theories that art history is associated with. The second complication in this is the decline in interest in naming art history in terms of theories that I had at the very top of the timeline. And here I have a little story. There was an event in Chicago at which there was a conversation between Michael Holley and Tom DaCosta Kaufman. And Michael or Tom, if either of you here, you can correct me if I get this wrong, but in my memory, that conversation went like this. Tom Kaufman said, well, so we have in art history today, it's a situation a little bit like if an archaeologist had a vase and broke it. It's shattered into a number of pieces, and it's our job to put it back together and make art history into a coherent enterprise again, to find leading concepts, theories, and so on that can work together. And Michael's response, in my memory, went in two different directions. First, she said she liked fragments. She liked the idea that you would, as an art historian, reach down, pick up your bit of psychoanalysis. Here's my bit of Lacan that I'm going to use to interpret this artwork. And then you have also, here's my bit from anthropology and so on. That was fine. And there was no need to rebuild something to be whole, that art history could be a fragmentary enterprise. And then also, there was the implication that these pieces are not necessarily labeled with theory names, that the pieces could be other sorts of fragments, not just pieces of theories, but things like bits of, this is my own elaboration, bits of narrative conventions or ideas about the archive and so on, that art history could be fragmentary in a more radical way so that it wouldn't break down according to theories. Theories would then be parts, sometimes fragments, sometimes not, but fragments in general, not to be assembled. At the MLA event, Jane Gallup said that literary theory is usually encountered by grad students in the introductory theory class. But in art history, there isn't always an introductory theory class. Sometimes because there's a historiography class, often at the grad level, and that's sometimes code for safely historicized introductions to theories for some students. But there tends not to be a theory class because I think the notion is that we all do theory. At my institution in the School of the Art Institute, my colleagues have had this discussion, decided not to have a required theory seminar because we all do theory in different ways. So theory is imagined as something that is already in many, many pieces, and it wouldn't be something you'd want to put together either as named theories or as something that would shape a discipline. Okay, and the third and last of these amendments or complications to that timeline is about the current state of affairs. I think that we're in a state now where two different kinds of writing that would in the past have been considered extreme or marginal have become the places where the discipline theorizes itself. So it's a position of a kind of double extremism. It leaves the center, that is most of the practice of art history, untheorized. Because we're now in a period, third decade of the 21st century, when we're after anxieties about interdisciplinarity and disciplinarity, or post-disciplinarity, or transdisciplinarity, or subdisciplinarity. That's one of Tom Mitchell's terms. And that means that we're also after the concern with borders of the discipline, how to police art history against visual studies, or how to include visual studies, or how to think about film and media studies in relation to art history and so on, visual anthropology, other fields. All these subjects were very much debated from the end of the 90s through, say, 2010. And there is literature on post-disciplinarity and transdisciplinarity and all the rest of that. That kind of interest has pretty much faded from the scene, leaving the normative operations of art history largely free of self-reflective literature. So the extreme or marginal literatures that I have in mind are a different kind of thing. They position themselves at two ends of the field, two edges of the field. So I'll just show an example of that. I exemplify one of these with Chris Wood's new book, The History of Art History. So there is a certain literature in the last decade or so that has taken an interest in historiography and the history and definition of the discipline, but in a way that looks back sometimes quite far. I mean, this book begins in the Middle Ages, so much before disciplinary art history existed, but in other cases back to, say, Kant or Hegel, and pictures a discipline that has a potential intellectual coherence with crucial central concepts without which it would be incoherent or purposeless. And Chris Wood's book is exemplary in this regard because of the way he stops effectively right around the 1960s, but starts in the 9th century. So there's, on the one hand, this kind of literature, which is in some ways, I like to think of it as optimistic in the sense that it's optimistic about the existence, the conceptual coherence and long-term sustainability of a discipline called art history, which nevertheless relies on certain conceptualizations. On the other hand, there's experimental writing that may still be taken as art history, or that maybe hopes to be taken as art history, but does not relinquish the claim of wanting to find new theories and new ways of writing. So that's Camille Vellotti's really excellent book on Tintoretto, which uses Deleuze. Because she's invested in Deleuze, she necessarily ends up with a critique of the discipline. It's not something that happens in Deleuze, and it's not something that needs to happen, of course, through Tintoretto, but it happens inevitably. And the book on the right is another contemporary anthology, recent anthology, which has some of the same things in it. And I've tried experiments along these lines, writing in a way that is of interest or experimental for some particular purpose and risks stepping over some border or looking away from art history anyway, risks not being taken as something that's of use for art history. I don't at all want to say that either one of these two kinds of literature, the retrenchment into a deeper philosophically informed art history, or the movement outward and away or forward or whatever, I don't want to say that either one of these is new. They both have examples that go back to the origin of art history as a discipline. At the moment, I'm reading William Empson's really interesting book on Buddhas. But they are characteristic, I think, of this moment. We had that these two extremes exist. There's this fabulous concept that's been coined by E.O. Wilson, the sociobiologist. He's writing about climate change and lack of species diversity and imagining a future in which humans live on the earth together with, say, cockroaches or whatever. And he calls it the Eremocene, which means age of loneliness. And I feel, in a sense, both of these two poles in current literature are lonely places. It'd be lonely, for example, to work at Yale, imagining that the thousands of new ideas and artworks and disciplines and artists and practices and methods since the 1960s are all, in some way, partly marginal or misguided offshoots of a nearly forgotten past, or fatalities of the presentism of the present. And I know from experience that it's lonely to write experimental text that can't easily be used by scholars who identify as art history and don't get used as art history. But that leaves the center curiously untheorized. So in the question that we've been asked, a lot depends on what counts as art history, especially if art history is divided in this way. Okay, last thing is, I'd like to say just a couple things about our panel. Our unyouthful white faces talking about art theory in 2020. I think there's this enormous problem with theory in art history, and it isn't the naming of questions that we've been talking about, it's something else. So I'm thinking in the context of the move, especially since Black Lives Matter and all the other events of 2020, to look seriously at racism and other prejudices, nationalism and so on embedded in art history, and to consider new strategies for diversity and inclusiveness and so on. These questions are not new in kind, but new in intensity. Some of the conversations have to do with theory, like in my department, for example, we have talked a bit about maybe not using so much Frankfurt School theory and so on. But there's another problem that I think is parallel to the problem of inclusivity and diversity in art history that institutions are all focusing on. It's parallel to that, but it has to do with theory. So it's not about the practices that get included and the racism that gets acknowledged and marked and remarked. It's about the theory that we use. In particular, I think that the theories, whether or not they're named, whether or not they're definitional in art history, have a geographic and cultural narrowness. And I'll just give two brief examples of that. First, I think there's not a single theory, a text or a concept written in a non-Indo-European language that is widely used to interpret art outside its country or origin. So for example, no Chinese term is widely employed to elucidate art outside of China. Same for theorists. There are no Chinese theorists whose work is widely known outside of China. Most of their work is untranslated. And second, the overwhelming majority of the world's most cited theorists are still French post-war and post-structuralists, or theorists more or less directly influenced by them. So starting with Foucault, Derrida, Barthes, and so on, to Rancière, Badiou, Malabou, Laruelle, Nancy, and others. There are a few exceptions that prove that rule, Benjamin and so on, but in general, they still very much are. The assumption there has to be that French post-structural theory and its offshoots are adequate to interpret the world's art from any culture or period. This seems extremely problematic to me. And I'll finish with a couple of slides of a book that I've just finished writing along with Erna Fiorentini, who's a historian of art and science who works in Karlsruhe. This is a big textbook on for undergraduates on visual practices inside and outside of art. We tried in this book to not do what other textbooks have done, that is use only conceptual concepts that have Greek and Latin roots. This happens in Critical Terms for Art History in both of its editions and in all the textbooks, including, of course, Art Since 1900. So we have some sections at the beginning of this book in which we introduce theories, concepts and theories that we then try to apply outside of their original context. So for example, in the Pali language, there's a word chitta, which is a pretty fabulous word because it means both painting or picture and consciousness. So it has all kinds of possibilities for interpreting outside of normal categories, Western categories. Xiang is another one that's a Chinese word, which is a word that circles around terms like representation, but can't be defined in those ways exactly. I don't at all claim that in this book what we've done is somehow create something that depends entirely on non-Latin, non-Greek root words, and there are many, many problems with this enterprise, but we felt that it was a kind of a moral obligation to try and see what would happen. I mean, I hope that book of ours actually gets outmoded soon and is replaced by art history texts that actually use entirely words that don't come from Greek and Latin. That would be pretty wonderful. So anyway, I think this is a much deeper source of ongoing Eurocentrisms in art history than any lack of diversity that has been concerning institutions this year. I don't think we can really think of ourselves as being after theory until we've begun to address this particular problem. And that's it. Thanks.